I'm Kathy Fields. Welcome to the afternoon plenary, or breakout session we'll call it. First of all, please silence your cell phones. That's number one. Number two, there will be question and answer. If you do have a question, make it short, because if it's really long, we'll miss out on all the excitement on the front of the stage. Is it still too low? Louder? All right, I'm going to scream. All right. This breakout session is, does world Jewry need a lobbyist in Israel? Today we're here to discuss what is and ought to be the role of world Jewry in Israeli government decision-making. Who in Israel speaks for the world's Jews? Israel government makes decisions which have sweeping impact for Jewish identity, security, and unity. If Israel is the nation of the Jewish people, who represents the interests of world Jewry in this process? Who is educating Israeli leaders how Israeli policies will impact the lives of Jews abroad? To discuss these questions are our panelists. Before me, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, right there on the left, or your right, the president of Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, and a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews, the value of Jewish past to the Jewish present. Dr. Yossi Beilin, who you just heard from, president of Beilin Business Foreign Affairs, been in the Knesset 5 terms, in the governments of Rabin, Perez, and Barak, known innovator already for Birthright and for the 1993 Oslo Accords. Yohanan Plesner, president of Israel Democracy Institute. He served as the first director general of Kadima and as one of the Knesset members from 2007 to 2013. Dr. Anita Friedman, one of our own, CEO of Jewish Family and Children's Services, president of the Koret Foundation, on the board of AIPAC, and certainly on many different policies, but as the policy consultant to the State of Israel Ministry of Social Affairs, also a friend and mentor. And now moderated by Netaly Ophir Flint, who as of just recently served as the CEO of Breakout. This is the cutting-edge strategy and leadership think tank based in Tel Aviv that you'll be hearing from today and throughout the rest of the day. Netaly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Feel free, all the people who are coming in, to find seats up front. I feel like the opening plenary almost set us up so perfectly for this discussion that we're going to have around the question of whether world Jewry needs a lobbyist in Israel. This is not a new topic, but perhaps given the outlook of 21st century Zionism that we've been talking about, perhaps there's a new level of ripeness, maybe even a sense of urgency around bringing this theoretical discussion into action. Primarily around, if we agree, or maybe we don't agree, and that's something that we're going to discuss today, if we agree on the idea that the diaspora is not a compromise, but rather an imperative for the future of the Jewish people, those living in Israel and outside of Israel. If we agree on the fact that both Israel and world Jewry are important and equal centers for the destiny of the Jewish people, and if we agree that it's imperative that Israel lives up to its role as the nation state of the entire Jewish people, what does that mean for representation of world Jewry in Israeli affairs as well? So we'll get to that big policy question in a moment. But before that, you heard very brief introductions of our distinguished panelists. But as you know, and you can see it in your booklets, these panelists are so distinguished that if we were to read their full bios, we would probably finish the session with them. So instead, I would like to really focus on Jewish peoplehood. And at the heart of Jewish peoplehood is mishpuche, right? So in order for us to have an argument around the dinner table, we need to know each other a little bit better. And as such, I would like to, inspired by the questionnaire of Inside the Actor's Studio. Are you familiar with that? James Lipman? So I would like to ask our distinguished panelists some questions about themselves. They have not seen the questions ahead of time. This is the first time they're hearing that we're going to be doing this. and I'll ask you to answer.
Have time to quit.
You still have. You can leave, but go really fast. So it's really going to be 1 or 2 word answers, please. And we're gonna start with you, Yohanan, and we're gonna go just around. Okay? So my first question: what is your favorite word?
Wow. Madhim.
Madhim. Madhim is wonderful.
Which represents my optimism.
Love. Anita. Love.
Hi.
Hi.
Apocalypse.
Well, this works. It's already working.
You see how much you get to know about a person by their favorite word, right? When you are not working, what is your favorite pastime? We'll start with you this time, Yehuda.
Cooking.
I don't have one.
You're always working.
Yeah.
You took your vows a long time ago. Huh? Jews don't have vows, but if we did, I would have taken them also. My favorite pastime is doing the world's most important job, which is being with my grandchildren.
Yeah. Nice. Yohanan.
Swimming and family.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally? Yehuda.
You're starting with me. A sense of urgency.
Cry.
Being here.
I think the knowledge that one can shape the state of affairs and not let them just transpire.
This time we'll start with you, Anita. What annoys you?
What annoys me?
Yeah. What pisses you off? Excuse my language.
Unnecessary political roughness.
Which way are you going?
Oh, Yohanan, sorry.
What annoys me?
Yeah.
Extremism.
Lack of nuance.
Bitul Torah. Waste of time.
Waste of time. Nice. And the final question: when was the first time you felt a deep sense of connection to the Jewish people? We'll start with you, Yossi.
I don't know whether this was the first time, but no question that the Eichmann case in Jerusalem, when I was very, let us say, much younger, it shook everything in me.
Interesting. Anita.
Almost immediately after childbirth. I mean, my childbirth.
Your childhood. Yohanan.
Me?
Yeah.
I was never asked this question, but what came to mind, the scene is sitting with my mother on some vacation, and I read about the War of Independence, and I started asking her questions about why are we just, and she gave me an entire lecture about the foundation of the state, and it was a sort of a strong formative moment, somewhere around the age of 10 or 11.
So interesting. And Yehuda.
I think living in Israel in the aftermath of the Rabin assassination.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, kind of, for giving us a little bit of a glimpse into who you are. And I think that will be very relevant to what you're going to be saying now as we speak and go a little bit macro onto the policy level. And so, as I said, what we want to have as a conversation today is a discussion about, given 21st century Zionism, given Israel as the nation state of the entire Jewish people, what does that mean for the need for some type of representation of world Jewry in Israel, in Israeli affairs? And to kick us off, I want to read a short quote written by Israeli Prize winner and thought leader Yecheskel Dror, who just celebrated his 90th birthday, and a year ago wrote an article in Haaretz newspaper, and he said the following: "The Jewish leaders of Israel should regard themselves as leaders of the Jewish people as a whole, and as such acquire the required understanding of the dynamics of Jewish communities worldwide, which at present most of them lack. No less than the diaspora serves as an important strategic asset of Israel, Israel has to behave as a main strategic asset of the diaspora. And as such, Israeli statecraft must increasingly take into account the implications of its choices for the future of all parts of the Jewish people. The diaspora should therefore participate in an institutionalized way, initially with a consultative role in decisions of the state that have crucial implications for the Jewish people as a whole. My question to all of you is, what do you think? Given everything that we've just discussed, and I think the opening panel was a great kickoff, what does it mean in the 21st century for world Jewry to have some type of representation, if at all, in Israel? And Yossi, it would be great if you could start off kind of with your vision on this topic.
Thank you. Well, I believe that we are speaking about partnership, not about lobbying. I don't think that the world Jewry needs a lobby in Israel. Well, you have sometimes Jewish federations which has contacts, permanent contacts with Israel and others, but the point is that so many things of what we decide back home have ramifications on the Jewish world that sometimes we don't know whether or not it will happen and what kind of ramifications. For example, Israel decided in the early 90s to put an end to the life of the head of the Hezbollah. And he was killed. And nothing happened. And after a while, relatively a long while, there was a big terrorist attack in Argentina. I'm sure that nobody around the table had an idea that there would be such an effect on their decisions. Was it necessary to have a representative of the world Jewry at such a cabinet meeting saying, hey, don't kill your enemy because it might have ramifications on the Argentinian Jewish community? Apparently not. So if we deal directly with things which have contact, which has ramifications on the world Jewry, if it is issues of matrimonial laws and whatever, then theoretically it is reasonable. But in which way? Now another thing. We are going on a very tight rope here. I don't have to remind you the Blaustein-Ben Gurion resolution. Jacob Blaustein, the head of the American Jewish Committee, then the most important Jewish organization here, said, no way, Mr. Ben Gurion, you will present yourself as the leader of the Jewish world. Who are you? I mean, some thousands of Jews live here. And you tell us that you represent the Jewish world? Thank you very much. Actually, what you are doing is putting us in an impossible situation of dual loyalty. We are speaking for the Jewish people in the United States. That's it. Not you. And never send here people who will encourage Zionism or Aliyah to Israel. Never, ever. If you want our help. If you don't want our help, it is okay, do what you want. Now, well, it was not a period in which we could easily give up on the help of our brethren here. So Ben Gurion actually submitted to all the demands of Jacob Blaustein. It was a huge victory. And whenever people in the government of Ben Gurion, later on, Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir, would say, on behalf of the Jewish people, we say that we will defend ourselves. You know, all these slogans. They got a letter from Jacob Blaustein saying, you remember that we have an agreement with the state of Israel? You are not allowed to speak on behalf of the Jewish world. Now, time changed. time changed, and it is a different story today. But still we know that from time to time there is a problem of a spy, if you remember here, and other things. And people are saying, yeah, dual loyalty or whatever, what are you doing to us? If you want spies, please take some goyim. Don't take Jews, and things like that. So those who remember the history of the relationship, there were fears here between us behind closed doors. There were fears in the Jewish community in the United States about their own future once the state of Israel was born. The fear was that people will tell them, their neighbors, you have now a Jewish state, go to this Jewish state. This is not your place. It happened, but very rarely. In other places, it happened also here, but it never became an issue. Thanks heaven. But we know, one of the things that we should know is not to be too rude about it, and to know the limits of hugging each other, and of course of talking on behalf of the whole Jewish world. This is why I believe that we need something more modest, like an American-Israeli Jewish committee, to speak to each other. We don't know so much. I, for one, I never lived abroad. I'm always going to hotels. I never studied here, I never taught here, never. And as much as I visited the United States hundreds of times, not tens of times, I'm always a visitor. Like I'm coming here for 2 days, we are on the plane for 3 days, and back, that's it. I don't know enough. I talk, I speak more than listen and whatever, but I don't know enough in order to know better what are the sensitivities. I need this kind of a cooperation, of partnership, real partnership. When I know when I'm saying something which is for me obvious, and people even applaud, and then somebody tells me, Yossi, what you did was a big mistake because you don't say that. I don't have an example right now, but it happened when I'm saying something, and because I don't know enough, people say to me, you made a mistake by mentioning some event or some word or whatever. People like myself who care and who don't know enough, they know much better than the usual Israeli or the American about the relationship, about the development of the American Jewry or whatever, but still, we need to work together and to help each other because we can help each other. The power of the American Jewry is so big that if it is being used on something which is very important for the American Jewry, it can change things. But it is very cautious and timid, not to overdo, and sometimes it is right. But when we are together, we can tell each other, now is your time. Now you can use your power in order to change something which is very, very interesting. Look at the law of the national law, which is really disgusting, is something which is against the American, the diaspora. We are sending, we are telling. We don't have to listen. Why should we? We know everything.
So what I'm hearing from you, Yossi, is no formal representation, a partnerships, ideally a formalized partnership in an organization.
Yeah.
What do you think, Anita? What's your vision?
I have a little bit of a different view of this. I have a little bit of a different view of this, but we're here to talk. Who remembers what happened almost exactly today, this day, 30 years ago? What was happening in terms of the U.S.-Israel relationship?
It was around the conversion bill of '88.
Who was a Jew?
Yeah.
Who was a Jew? Oh, genius point, right here. Whoever gets these questions right gets a genius point, which means you get an extra Cliff Bar. Who remembers that? There were airlifts San Francisco Bay Area, we were chartering jets. Thousands of people, all the Jewish organizations were flying to Israel to lobby, to partner, to talk about the disaster of the law of changing who's a Jew.
Yeah. It's actually exactly now, because the elections were in November.
It's exactly now. That's right. So it's, I always feel like the best antidote to hysteria is a dose of history.
And it worked.
And it worked. Yeah. It worked. Okay, so that's why, in the end, those things are important. Now, things have changed somewhat now too. And we're starting that conversation. Everybody's talking about the Great Divide. I mean, I've been speaking all over the place on this issue. Everybody's talking about it, and that's the beginning of change. That people have to become aware of the fact that there's a problem, and there's some urgency to this. And things are quite different now than they were before. I know my Uncle Solomon always used to ask me, you may have heard this story, you may have Uncle Solomon too. He's the repository of all Jewish knowledge, and he lives in Brooklyn. So he said, so tell me, Anita, how are things in the Jewish world? Because he knows I'm in the Jewish world. I said, good. And he said in 2 words, I said, not good. So I do a lot of marriage and family counseling. Professionally, I'm a clinical psychologist. And for my whole career, I've been working with people who are working on trying to save their marriage, improve their marriage, or part ways without a total disaster. And you said 2 things that I think were very important. One is, and we know this from marriage counseling, first of all, you have to have a partner who cares enough to come to counseling, to engage in the dialogue, and you have to be able to listen, which is the hardest thing to do if you've ever been in a relationship with another human being, especially a marriage. And you said those 2 things. You said people have to care and they have to be willing to listen. The situation right now, in my view, is a little different, and I'll just make a comment about that, because I work in the Jewish community, and in my capacity as the executive director of Jewish Family and Children's Services, which is one of my hats, I see the internal workings of tens of thousands of Jewish families, and what's important, what bothers them, what they hope for their children, what's happening with their children, what happens when your children decide to take a different direction than you've taken. I mean, these are issues. In this country now, the issue is that there are less and less people who even care about this issue, and less people who are willing to listen. And I think the same thing actually is somewhat true in Israel. The leadership, those of us who were involved in Jewish life, who are deeply involved in Jewish life and Israel-diaspora relations, we care and we want to learn how to listen. But the vast majority of people, more and more, don't really care that much about this issue and don't really want to listen. And so that's true in Israel, and it's true in this country. And until we start to change that among the masses of people, it's going to be very hard to get the leadership to really listen to a lobbyist or to a new organization. I can tell you wearing another hat, and then I'll stop. Everything in this room is just confidential, right? In this room?
Of course.
Is that right? Just among us, right? You won't share this. So I'm on the part of the leadership of AIPAC. You may have heard of it. And we have a cabinet, which is like an executive committee, and we spend a lot of time in Israel lobbying and talking and sharing, and you have to have a partner there who wants to listen. And we don't always have that. So there's work to be done on both sides of a bridge that's under a lot of pressure and a lot of duress right now.
And just to sum up, does that work need to happen bottom up? Is that what I'm hearing? That it's grassroots work?
I think that there has to be grassroots work in Israel to understand peoplehood, and there has to be grassroots in this country to understand how to answer the question of why be Jewish.
Thank you. Yehuda.
So going back to your original question, does world Jewry need a lobbyist in Israel? I'm going to come out with a strong no in ways that pick up on some of what what Yossi alluded to before, but maybe push a little further as to why I don't want to see this conversation translate into formal or institutional infrastructure on behalf of the Jewish people. And it's for two reasons, both of which are under the heading of believing that any such framework is fundamentally anti-democratic. What I mean by that is we've heard a lot today already and in this session so far that the State of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. That's true, and it's been one of the goals of the State of Israel since its founding. But the other commitment that the State of Israel has made since its founding is that the State of Israel is also a state of its citizens, who are not all Jewish. And the idea of creating governmental or semi-governmental further infrastructure to represent the interests of world Jewry runs counter to at least that second mission of the State of Israel's principal responsibility, which is to be a nation state for all of its citizens. The second piece of that, though, is we've had for over 100 years a whole series of non-governmental and semi-governmental institutions that were part of the Zionist infrastructure that brought about the creation of the State of Israel. Those were the first Zionist congresses. That's the continued World Zionist Organization, the Sochnut, the Jewish Agency. These are semi-governmental institutions connected to government structures, connected to government funding, and their place within the map is already questionable as democratic institutions, both because the State of Israel has to have had converted itself from a pre-state project of the Jewish people to an actual government with ministries. So what happens to those infrastructures of pre-state government? And that has been an open question for them all along. One of their main functions has been aliyah and promoting support for the State of Israel, but their relationship with world Jewry and with the State of Israel has become more complicated over time. It's also complicated on the American Jewish side because the average American Jew who is the client of a so-called lobbyist for world Jewry, the average American Jew themselves doesn't see themselves. This is just, we know this, especially in the Bay Area. We as American Jews don't see ourselves as accountable in ways that were true in the era of Jacob Blaustein to national Jewish organizations. We don't see ourselves represented by national Jewish organizations. We as American Jews are highly idiosyncratic among world Jewry in terms of our own skepticism that anybody speaks on behalf of American Jewry, much less world Jewry. So the idea that you would come in and place formal infrastructure to represent world Jewry with all of its competing and complex interests and be essentially reinforcing a non-democratic or a semi-democratic infrastructure in this moment seems to me to be actually trying to move backwards to 1897 instead of moving forward to 2019. In both of and here's where I do come closer to what Yossi was talking about and Anita as well. The citizen is sovereign. That's true both for the State of Israel and it's true for the American Jewish community. So any efforts that we want to make, and I support this entirely, it's like the bulk of my life's work is sitting at the threshold between these communities, standing in the breach and sustaining this relationship. But all of that work starts with the belief that the citizen is sovereign, which means that the primary work is work of education. And it's both, you're not gonna change the reality in Israeli society. The Prime Minister of Israel will not ultimately hold on to the Kotel Agreement because of a lobbyist in Jerusalem on behalf of liberal Jewry. The Prime Minister will create a Kotel Compromise if he has an 18% of the electorate in Israel that is equivalent to Haredi parties who make cases for religious pluralism as a central feature of electoral politics. So if you want to change these realities, it's not through symbolic infrastructure or architecture, it's actually through the processes of educating a populace, both in America and Israel, as to why the outcome that you want is actually in their own sovereign interests that they would want to get involved with.
So I'm hearing three. So I'm hearing three resounding no's to various degrees. And I'm going to let you in a second, Yohanan, but I want to be devil's advocate for a second. And you mentioned the Kotel Compromise, right? And there are other examples that we saw just in this last year, right? The collapse of the Kotel Compromise, the blacklisting of reform and conservative rabbis by the rabbinate, and other examples of policies that have been made in Israel that on the primarily North American, world Jewry, but primarily North American side, have caused such deep crisis and upsetness, and even more people feeling alienated from the state of Israel that proclaims itself to be the nation state of the entire Jewish people, right? You're hearing that on one side. And let me tell you, I was sitting in Tel Aviv when all of this was happening, and except for maybe a handful of us that actually work in this field, not only was there not a discussion about whether it should be or should not be, and better or for worse, the average Israeli, even the very educated, highly connected Israelis, didn't even know this was going on. The conversation was not even happening. Forget about whether they agreed or disagreed. It was not happening anywhere, really anywhere. And so on one hand, I'm hearing education, right? On the other hand, I'm hearing these are really long processes of education. It takes generations, sometimes more, to change these types of entrenched paradigms. Maybe it's too little too late. By the time we're done educating, there could be more major crises that have created a rift that is so deep. And my question again is there more that we could be doing and should be doing? And I'm putting it out there, and please, Yohanan.
Well, I hope you're not going to suspect that there was some kind of a collusion here and that we've coordinated, and I hope I'm not going to disappoint you, but I think there are ample channels for enhancing such influence, impact, but the formal representation, institutional model can backfire and is probably not the right way to go. Look, Israel and North American Jewry are the two major miracles of the Jewish people of the past century after the big catastrophe. And both have reached a point. We're at age 70. We finished our adolescence as a state, and world Jewry obviously has a North American Jewry has reached a point where it has its own challenges about the future, and we're now both sitting and trying to think and write our future, and we understand that our futures are intertwined, and we need to write them together. And Israel is now undergoing a major challenge of what it means to be a Jewish and democratic state. And things that we took for granted in the past can no longer be taken for granted. Our democratic values and institutions and basic norms that were never part of the political discussion are now on the table. And in this respect, joining forces can amplify and provide a strong vector and momentum for those who want to strengthen Israel as a vibrant, prosperous, open, liberal democracy and nation state of the Jewish people. And none of that can be taken for granted, but Israel as yet is small enough, and therefore one can actually have quite a lot of influence if you get together and try to influence it. Israeli public opinion. Israeli public opinion, on the one hand, has a strong sentiment in support of unity of the Jewish people, nation state of the Jewish people. We're all Jewish, we're all together, mishpacha, all of that. At the same time, if you tell Israelis, do you want a world Jewry to make decisions in Israel and so on, there's also something of, both pride and we have to make our own decisions and so on. So if you try to, there's a very fine line between engagement, inclusion, where you can end up on top and sort of and have influence in Israel, and if you build it in a bad institutional manner, it can backfire. Even now in Israel, we have the issue of voting of Israelis that are overseas. So it's not Jews overseas, diaspora, Israelis overseas, and I think there's a very strong case for limiting that option to Israelis who was sort of overseas for a while, 2 or 3 years, but not anything beyond that, because we don't want people who chose to live here for 30 or 40 years deciding whether we go to war. It doesn't make sense, and whether we raise taxes. So what can be done? So I think that the current institutions, whether it's the Sochnut, the national institutions that were created a century ago, I'm not sure. Supposedly, they were supposed to provide the answer for all of those platforms for dialogue, influence, and on areas that have to do with the Jewish aspects and aspects that have to do with Israel diaspora relations. I don't want to be offensive, and I'm sure there are people here involved, but I don't think that if in the past I'd said, let's reform the national institutions, the Jewish agency, and they will serve this role, with all humbleness, I do not support that line of action. Number two, existing institutions here in the US, let's take AIPAC as an example. When there was a nation-state bill, supposedly, if AIPAC as an institution would come to the Prime Minister and say, look, we want to fire up our base. Our base is, 60, 70, 80% non-Orthodox Jews who are very committed to Israel. This legislation that drives a wedge between Israel and non-Orthodox Jews makes our job very difficult.
Were you there in the room with us when we were talking?
Yeah, but if I learned something in politics, and Yossi is a little more experienced in my 6 years in the Knesset and 2 years as head of what was then a ruling party, I have zero belief in what's going on in closed doors. People are so nice and sensible in closed doors. I have no interest in what politicians tell me in a closed door. What matters is in public. I don't care if they're very smart and articulate in a closed door. So, and that's a decision. I gave AIPAC as an example, but it's the same with many institutions, and I understand the logic, that have a DNA of we do not deal with Israeli internal affairs. But those internal affairs now affect you. So one has to be sensitive to know in which issues do we get involved, in which. But by and large, I think many institutions should sort of change, because it's our future and it's our interests and it's our kids' interests. The Jewish organizations like AIPAC, and I know, I've been working for AIPAC for years and meeting all the delegations and so on. Nevertheless, I think it's time. And what else can be done? Look, the taglit idea of, let's listen to each other and let's know each other, and the reverse taglit, all of those kinds of things I think are extremely important. So there isn't a one solution and one institution. That kind of one set of institutions of getting to know each other. Number two, there are quite a few, and Israeli civil society is wonderful and active, and a lot of it, let's be fair, it wouldn't have existed without leadership, ideas, resources from American Jewry. And Israeli civil society is extremely impactful, and the institute that I lead is an Israel diaspora enterprise. That's an example. Many others belong to other institutions, and so Israel is a democracy where if you take leadership and decide that you want to have impact, you can have that impact. So I mean, more such joint institutions. And two last points. Israeli public opinion. Israel is small, can be very much educated, and there are tools and means of how to do it. And finally, electoral reform. When I was in the room as a Knesset member, and I was considered the sort of, if you will, as a Knesset member, the lobbyist of the American Jewish community, the non-Orthodox streams, and so on. I just sort of found myself in that position because no one else did it. And you find yourself, I wouldn't say begging, but trying to persuade and say this and that, and it's the right thing. But in politics, you need power. And Yehuda mentioned that. And as long as you don't have power, you can beg and you'll get maybe a minute change, a footnote here and a footnote there. So electoral reform can minimize or change the otherwise absolute power that the ultra-Orthodox parties have on domestic issues. And one can think of, and I can think of other ways, but you have to play the game and have real power, and otherwise it's just begging, and nobody likes weak people.
Thank you, Yohanan. So you know the joke. Ask 4 Jews a question, you'll get 5 opinions. Here, I think we have pretty similar agreement, more or less, around here. So maybe there is hope for the Jewish people yet. I'm going to let each one of you respond very briefly, because I know that you want to respond to each other. And then we have very little time, so we're going to open it up. If you have a question, then please, I'm looking if there are mics. If not, then you'll raise your hand and I will call on you. But really 2-minute responses from each other. Yeah.
On one level, I'm not particularly concerned because similar to in this country, this has to do with human behavior. In this country, we have a lot of problems right now, a lot of divisions. We always have. But when 9/11 happened, there was extraordinary unity here. Everybody put out an American flag. Similarly, around true existential crisis to the Jewish people, many people mentioned that people come together around that, and I think that would continue to be true. We're talking about different levels here, though, not just an existential threat on that magnitude. And we're also talking about changing hearts and minds. Everybody to one degree is talking about changing hearts and minds, which happens. But it has to happen at every level. Everyone in this room is involved in organizational life and can find a way to change the mindset that understands that it's an urgent matter to keep the Jewish community abroad and in Israel stitched together. But they're going to take different forms. We have a big challenge in this country, in the United States, which is the first time we've faced the kind of challenge that we face about Jewish identification and involvement. Israel faces another challenge, which has to do with almost no concept of Jewish peoplehood. I don't think it's taught in the schools. I don't think people think about that. We started a little pilot project, I'll just say briefly, with Shalem College in my capacity as a president of the Cred Foundation. Because we only fund in one area now. We fund only projects that are bridge building projects, only projects that strengthen the relationship and work towards changing hearts and minds. So we tried a little pilot. They picked 25 of their top students who are going to go into government or go into NGO leadership and who'd never been to the United States, and they brought them to the Bay Area, and they spend 10 days taking a look at how we live our lives in the Bay Area, about pluralism and all the different voices and how we're organized and how we care for each other and what our values are. And when I asked them afterwards in a follow-up lecture, give me one word that you would describe your experience as coming to the United States, they said shocked. Shocked. A few people said surprised, because they wanted to tone it down a little bit, maybe. They were just shocked. They had no idea. And they said they came to America as Israelis, but they left as Jews. Now, you understand what that really means. You know, the same reverse happens, obviously, which is why we increase Jewish identification and involvement by taking young people to Israel, but the follow-up is lacking. So each of our societies has to really grapple with the form that this threat takes and then come together at every level. On the governmental level, I mean, several people mentioned that organizational relationships actually are quite deep. There's a lot of exchange. There's a lot of working together organizationally, which is the good news. But it has to go further. It has to go further, faster, and deeper, which means involving the people and not just the leadership who are not necessarily on the same page always.
Thank you. You wanted Yehuda?
Yeah, I wanted to push back on your pushback, if that's okay. You had asked about, is the way that we're talking about education and grassroots change just too slow? Are there issues of tremendous urgency? The Kotel is a good example. And I think there are 2 reasons why we have to be cautious about the being triggered by these moments of urgency and changing course. And the 2 reasons are, first of all, you know, those of us who are in this for the long haul recognize that the failure of the Kotel Compromise was not the issue. It was symbolic of a much larger set of concerns that American Jews have about religion in the Israeli public square and the government's role, the challenges of integrating Jewish and democratic values, and that those are not just about religion, but they're also about security and occupation. All of those fuel larger questions about the vitality long-term of Israeli democracy. So the idea that we would perform a kind of act of lobbying or protest when it comes to the Kotel risks signaling that what we really are concerned about are short-term political gains, when we're actually interested in a longer-term question of whether Israel is living up to its own values and whether we see ourselves in that story. The second resistance I have to the pushback is, I think all of us who work in education know exactly what you're talking about, which is that profound fear that you're going to work on something for 30 years and you don't know whether you will actually achieve change. We know that because that's actually what the business is. If you go into education knowing exactly what your outcomes are going to be and when you're going to achieve them, you're not doing education. In fact, you'll wind up doing bad education. And that's actually the great vulnerability of working in education. If you do it right, it's unknown and it's a little bit scary. The biggest way to disrupt good education processes is through looking for short-term immediate outcomes, because it actually gets in the way of doing really good educational work. And it leads you to doing kind of performances and symbolic exercise of showing the change that you've achieved in the world, when in fact you actually have to be in it for the long run. So I want to gamble on long-term educational processes, because honestly, when I look back at like the sequence of Jewish history, the only way in which the Jewish people have actually managed to transform what Judaism has meant from one generation to 2 or 3 generations later has been through investing in ideas and then investing in long-term education. It has not been through short-term political performances.
Yeah, Yossi.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I see the big kind of dilemma between the two things. I mean, education is very, very, very important. There is nothing more important than education. But on the other hand, reactions are needed from time to time. Kind of rapid deployment force in order to react on specific issues. And I can give you an example, the example of the women of the Western Wall, which is not very complimenting for me. I must admit that for me, personally, it was not a big deal. Why? I'm so secular that it is difficult for me to fight for women who decide to pray for a wall. Right? Okay, this is my fault. It did not, unlike some other things, that is deprivation, that I say, how come you deprive this sector or whatever. They came, what was the problem with the women? Mainly that there was an agreement and the government reneged on it. More than the substance of the issue. They were offended, rightly so, by the fact that there was already an agreement, and because of the fear of the ultra-religious, the prime minister or the government decided to renege on it. Now, for me, had there been such a room of consult between Israeli Jews and American Jews, had the American Jews told me, with all due respect to your anti-religion religion, in that case, it is much more than that. It is a cultural case. It is women equality and many other things, and we want you to help us to fight. I would be ready to do that. The only point that I'm raising is that I need this echo. I need to know that it is such a big deal. I admit I wasn't aware enough of the dimensions of this crisis.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying now is very representative of most of Israeli decision makers and definitely the public. They just weren't aware, and that's part of the issue. With your permission, I'm going to open it up, and then I'll let you respond, okay? Do we have a mic, or we're just going to ask people to? So we're going to start in the back over there. That was the first hand that I saw. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ophir. So the question is, there's already a lot of influence by American Jewry on Israel. Sheldon Adelson, for instance, contributes a lot for political causes in the U.S., but also in Israel. And so, and there's other from, I'm sure others. So, the question for American Jewry, if American Jewry is interested, and I think it should be interested in influence Israel, they can actually, put the power of the purse and affect it in long-term education, which I think is actually the best way to do it long-term, but also in more short-term and even influence Israeli election, with the power of the purse, essentially. And so the question is, why not? I mean, you don't need to affect, you don't need an American organization to formally do it, but you can have actually American institutions, do it as they already do it, in some sides already.
Thank you for the question. We're going to take 2 more questions, and then we'll let you all respond. Yes, the woman in the back.
Hi, my name is Ariella. When I think about lobbying, the job of a lobbyist is to be a paid employee who convinces legislators about some powerful group that stands behind them. That's what a lobbyist is. And in this case, I think the question presumes that American Judaism is a very important and powerful player, and we just need to convince the Israeli government of how much power stands behind this theoretical lobbyist. I take Yehuda's point seriously that American Jews don't have that power and maybe ought not have more of that power. But I'm also playing with the idea or the concern that you raised, which is that it is really complicated here. It is hard to figure out who would be this lobbyist. How would you speak for all the various constituencies? And my own skepticism. I don't want somebody speaking for me. Who is this person? At the same time, if I can't sort that out for myself, how in the world do I want someone in Israel, an Israeli legislator, who's looking at their own constituents to sort it out? And I'm thinking about the model of public lobby that is a public interest research group, or something like that that would have the standing not of being a lobbyist behind closed doors, but a democratic way of trying to officially, I don't want to say speak for, but speak to the plurality here, and some way of trying to make those concerns so it doesn't come as a shock to the Israeli public, these things that are held very, very dear, at the same time trying to make the complexity seem less complex here as well as in Israel.
Thank you for the question. Yohanan.
Well, I'll try to combine the answers to or at least address both comments. Look, there isn't one American Jewish constituency. There are many, as you know, shades and lights, and the community is diverse, and it's great that that's the state of affair. And there won't be a one lobbyist for those many voices, and therefore the real outcome is engaging in multiple channels of dialogue, of conversation, of education. And as Yossi mentioned, when there comes a moment where certain issues, like the 1988 issue, that are very, or the nation-state bill that was very offensive to world Jewry, you will have enough of those channels, voices, organizations getting together and projecting their voice, their power into Israel. Ophir, and the answer is, it's perfectly, at least in my eyes, legitimate for American Jewry. Israel defines itself as a nation state of the Jewish people. American Jewry is obviously a major part of a constituency of that Jewish state, has skin in the game, and the democracy allows for mobilization and for civil society. That's the basic idea of a democracy, and there are many who do so. And I think depending on if we combine the two, there are enough voices that need to be amplified, obviously, with resources. It can have a major influence within Israel. And in Israel, we can also, I think, beyond influencing the political sphere, if we speak more at the grassroots level, we have so much to learn. Yossi mentioned that the sort of sense of the uneasy sense that he felt towards religiosity in Israel. When I happened to live here a few years, and in Israel I rarely go to synagogue, but when I came here, it's an entirely different experience because it's more of a cultural, social identity, and I found myself going to synagogue. I actually understood also what the rabbi said, rather than just sort of an ongoing. And in this respect, we have so much to learn. And if we position it and adjust it based on joint conversations, you see that many Israelis that today, if you tell them reform or conservative Jews would feel like it's blasphemy, and at the same time their day-to-day practices are very much like the reform and conservative. So I mean, there's much we can learn from each other, and it can all be done through a myriad or multiple channels of dialogue and so on. There's no one simple answer.
Yeah.
Yehuda, your brief response, because I want to continue to open it up.
Yeah, Ariella, those institutions exist in Israeli society. In fact, the most likely change agents in Israeli society on issues of religious pluralism and human rights and minority rights and Jewish values in the public square and electoral reform, all of these institutions exist in a vast nonprofit NGO landscape in Israeli society. And to your question, their biggest challenge is motivating philanthropic dollars. In fact, this is the real gap here is overwhelmingly American Jews support those issues, but there's huge funder fatigue in the American Jewish community, and the funding of those initiatives in Israeli society by American Jews is going down because they're watching that those efforts are not succeeding yet, thinking in short term, and they're losing philanthropically to right-wing donors who are aware that philanthropic dollars change the texture, they change the maps. They literally change. And here, that's part of my argument is instead of erecting a new piece of infrastructure to solve for this issue, invest in the existing NGO infrastructure that's already there and that's dying to do this work that is native to Israeli society, that doesn't risk being thought of as being, it's not
foreign
American
intrusion.
Jews. It's not foreign intrusion. These are the Israelis who are actually desperate for American-Jewish partnership on a series of values in which they see eye to eye, and who are badly in need of this kind of infusion of passion that translates this ideological commitment into the stuff that'll make it possible.
So we're nearing the end of our session. I'd like to get 2 more questions, and I'll let you all respond and close up. And you can also respond to one of the 2 if you didn't get a chance to yet. So we'll take 1, 2, and then 3, and that's it.
Gary Ray, thank you for a wonderful panel. For those Israelis here on the panel looking toward the United States, or diaspora Jewry, I might add, which is beyond the United States, what are the first 3 issues you would put on the agenda, and how would you carry them out? And for the Americans here too,
Israeli issues that are...
as Israelis looking toward diaspora,
Okay.
and for Americans looking to Israel, what are the first 3 things you would put on the agenda?
We're going to take the last 2 questions, and then you.
Hi, Shalom, Ben. I have a question to keep us on the subject of the panel, and I know we moved away from a lobbyist a little bit to another organization. So I have a question whether this organization is also going to be telling Jewish organization in the United States also what to do. And is it going to be a 2-way street or just one-way street when a Jewish community is telling the sovereign state of Israel what to think about, or also the opposite, what the state of Israel is going to tell the Jewish communities, it's not one community, outside of Israel, what to think?
Thank you. And just project, final question. Yep.
Thank you very much for the...
Speak up, please.
Yes, as a former Israeli, I have to say that, thank you, that I was quite ignorant about what it means to be Jewish. I was educated in Israeli secular education, and coming here and having lived here for several years, the meaning of being Jewish has completely changed. My question to the panel is, to what extent do you see the difference in how people perceive their relationship to their religion, and to understand, ultimately going down to the very basics of believing being relevant in this conversation? because to me it seems that it's beyond just cultural differences, that some of the basic understanding of the Jewish religion, understanding, essentially the secular Jewish population or Israeli population is really, in my view, ignorant. And again, this is based on my experience. Things may have changed. I don't believe so. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. And as moderator, I will take the prerogative of adding in my final question, and then you can all choose which of all of these to address, because it is a lot. And that is, if we're going less to the side of the spectrum of a formal lobbyist or some type of formal representation and more to the side of education and to conversation, my question is, what role do the Israeli-American community, right? The Israelis, depending how you count, there are between 500,000 to 1 million Israelis living outside of Israel. What role, if at all, do they have in helping have this nuanced conversation around the relationship and the perceived gap that we're feeling? And with that, we'll start with you, Yohanan, and then you'll take it from there. And
short answer to Ben, obviously it's a bilateral conversation, and as Yehuda mentioned, I mean, once you have a real conversation and you speak and you also listen, so it's supposed to affect both sides. Short answer to Gary, it's easy for me to answer because I devote my life to it. So it's number one, ensuring Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people, but it's Jewish and democratic normative and institutional foundations. Number two, Jewish pluralism in Israel. So it's the state will not define what type of Judaism can be practiced in the Jewish state, but rather open to all types, and it has many implications, both in terms of funding religious services and so on. And number three, structural reforms, and specifically electoral reform. All of these, Israel is relatively small, and in my experience, and it's not only a story of negative developments. There are a lot of positive, optimistic things happening, and a lot of bad ideas that are blocked and turned into good ideas. So it's all about activism, leadership, and building strong partnerships and coalitions.
Anita.
Well, I think we're all trying to accomplish the same thing, which is to help Jews all over the world understand that our individual faiths are linked to the collective fate. The issue is, and that's a big idea, and eventually all brilliant ideas deteriorate into work. So we are now trying to find our way. What's the best method by which to accomplish this?
Yes.
I believe that Israelis have to grapple with their own issues. We can try to influence, we can try to fund. I don't think funding is the answer. I think Israelis need to develop a culture of philanthropy to fund their own imperatives more. We have other issues we have to grapple with in this country. If the Israelis are successful with their fight on their front, and we're successful with the fight on our front, then we'll find our way to continue to be stitched together. I don't think it's just a matter of education. I think it has to be political action. It has to be, as you said, as I think everybody said, everybody in this room brings something to the party, to the peoplehood party. All of us have to find a way to influence our organizations individually and collectively to understand the imperative of the current circumstance that we're facing.
Thank you. Yossi.
Well, about this interesting question of the three things that we would like the American Jewry or the diaspora to do, it's Jewish continuity. And this is the first and the second and the third. The most important thing is Jewish continuity. For me, Israel is a platform for Jewish continuity. If it cannot assure that, Israel doesn't interest me. Doesn't interest me. The easy way in which a non-religious Jew can keep his or her Judaism is to live in Israel, because it is everywhere. I'm always saying, as long as you smell Lag BaOmer on Lag BaOmer, it's fine with me. because it means that they are Jews, and I want to leave this world knowing the Jews are around and that they will be there forever, whatever ever means. And in order to do that, we need to do many things. It is not going to happen naturally. We have to assist it and to invent all the time and to reinvent ourselves and to invent all the time tools in order to make it possible. And to run away from the question of why being a Jew, for heaven's sake. It is not a relevant question. I mean, you don't have so many kids who want to leave the religion and to become Muslims or Christians or whatever, or Buddhists, and they come to you and say, Father, Mother, tell me, why should I remain Jewish? It is there. I mean, we should keep it. We should keep the family. It is like, why should I be the part of your family? If you ask this question, it is already bad enough. Don't ask this question. You are part of this family. Be proud of your parents if it is possible for you. And be happy when you see your brothers and sisters. And that's it. So, I mean, as we want our families to stick together and to meet and to be proud of each other, we want the people to be like that. So the question is the survival of these people. And in order, and we have to pay the price for survival because it is not for free. And the price for survival is to contain structures and relatives who 100 years ago, 50 years ago, would have never considered themselves, and we would never conceive them as Jews. If we do not do that, I think that we are doomed. Both as Israelis, where mixed marriages is a very marginal, if at all, question, and in the diaspora, and mainly here. So this is the big challenge that which we are having. For those who care, I mean, I can imagine that there are many Jews who do not care about Jewish continuity from morning to night. And this is why I call it the Parents' Council. Those who, among the parents in the class, who really care and are ready to dedicate some time in order to prepare the different parties and the journeys or whatever of their kids. Apparently, we are these people. So our role is to keep the family together. That's it.
Thank you, Yossi. Very
I'll
briefly.
briefly answer your question, which I think relates to this gentleman's question here as well, about the role of Israelis in America. You know, there's an incredible analogy to the Talmudic period at a category of individuals known in both the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud as nechote, the individuals who traveled back and forth between these two communities, spoke both languages, but more importantly understood both native cultures, and therefore are responsible for the preservation of some broad shared Judaism, even though obviously Babylonian Judaism and Land of Israel Judaism were quite different from one another and remained quite different. So I think Israelis have the potential to serve that function, to be bridge builders. I think it's also true about folks mostly in the NGO sector in Israel who are deeply tied into the American Jewish community, speak English well, and follow American Jewish trends. And I would like to see that community invested in as a bridge builder between these two places, but it has to be done correctly. And what I mean by that is when the efforts involved around engaging Israelis in America are about trying to constitute them as their own organization, as their own denomination of Judaism that actually entrench some ideological or linguistic barriers between them and other Jews in America, not helping. When the effort is actually about recognizing what is different and shared about what they understand about Israel and what they understand about the American Jewish community, it's highly leverageable. I think this JCC is the field leader in the country around both engaging Israelis as Israelis in America, but also building bridges into the non-Israeli Jewish community in America. There still is one. When we do that, we're actually treating Israelis like nechote, as bridge builders, as opposed to trying to treat them as though they're some other denomination.
Yep. So to close, one-word answer to my final question of the Inside the Actors studio. Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
I said before, I'm an optimist.
Hope. Yossi, optimist or pessimist?
I can give you an answer of one word because I'm an optimist that if you do the right thing, you can succeed. I'm not an optimist that things will be better. This is something that I never accept.
Yehuda?
Straight optimist.
Straight optimist. And with that, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists.